All right, everybody. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for coming today. I'm Judy Coffin, and I am the co-host with Sally Charnow of French Press this year. And today's French Press, which we know you signed up for, focuses on Nina Gelbart's book, Minerva's French Sisters, Women of Science in the Enlightenment. French Historical Studies, as you probably know, offers a very wide variety of programming about France and about the Francophone world. We do French press, we do virtual and online conferences, we do small gatherings, we do large meetings, we do focused thematic conversations, and more open-ended, free-flowing exchanges. And in all of these ways, we try to keep our scholarly community a vibrant one. And on that, before moving on to our discussion of this book, let me take this moment to remind you about the Society's upcoming conference in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm going. I hope a lot of you are. It's going to be on March 24th to 26th, and we hope to see lots of people there. We know this is a tricky time, but being together would really be fun and rewarding. And Sally's going to put the conference information website in the chat. We also have a couple of things coming up before the conference. One on February 27th, which Sally will put the link to that in the chat towards the end of today's session. And then a new addition to French Press, two graduate student lightning rounds as a kind of run-up to the conference. And we'll send out information about all of that. So a few quick housekeeping notes. For security reasons, we turn the audience's videos off, and we've muted everybody except the speaker, and we've disabled the chat. When the discussion opens it up for the Q&A, and we'll let you know, the chat will be available for your questions, comments, so send them to either of the discussion. So again, many thanks for joining us, and I will now pass it over to Sally, who will introduce Kathleen, who will introduce Nina. Enjoy yourselves, everyone.
Hi, good afternoon from Brooklyn, and it's my pleasure to introduce Kathleen Wellman, who'll be our discussant this afternoon. And I just want to take a minute to thank both Nina and Kathleen for being so gracious in December, for stepping aside and letting us create the space to commemorate and honor Tyler Stovall. But we're so delighted that we could find this date to come together for this fantastic book. So Kathleen Wellman, for those of you who don't know, is a professor of history at Southern Methodist University. And her most recent book, quite recent in fact, Hijacking History, How the Christian Right Teaches History and Why It Matters. And that came from Oxford University Press this year, last year in 2021. So I'm actually going to pass it on to Kathleen, who's going to introduce Nina Gelbart.
Thank you, Sally, for the introduction, and thank you, Judy and Sally, for organizing this session and promoting this really wonderful way for historians to engage with new work in the field. It is a very great pleasure to introduce Nina Ratner Gelbart and to discuss some of the highlights of her very distinguished career. I am so happy to have this opportunity to continue what's been an ongoing conversation with Nina over many years about the women of science she has always called her ladies. Nina has spent virtually her entire career at Occidental College, where she is professor of history and Anita Johnson Ward Professor of Women's Studies. I can tell by many names on the screen that you are familiar with Nina's work and her many presentations to the Western Society, to French Historical studies, ASEX, and many of those presentations were the grounding for the dozens of articles that she has published, as well as the book chapters. And the quality and quantity of Nina's work has been recognized and supported by the NIH, the NEH, the ACLS, and the Guggenheim Foundation. But this is preliminary to discussing Nina's books, all of them prize winners. All of Nina's work attests to her consistent interest in the French Enlightenment, women's history, and the history of science ever since she received her PhD from the University of Chicago, working with Keith Baker in Enlightenment and French history and Alan Davis in the history of science. And I'm very pleased to acknowledge that I share that academic lineage with Nina. But about her books. First one, in Feminine and Opposition Journalism in Old Regime France, Le Journal des Dames, 1759 to 1778, published by the University of California Press, 1987. Nina restored this journal to the pre-revolutionary history of the French press and not only highlighted the work of female journalists who had been discounted as derivative, but argued instead that the journal, operating with tacit permission, was both feminist and subversive. And this work, like all of her work, has brought women into light and integrated them into the Ancien Regime. It was awarded the Sierra Prize of the Western Association of Women Historians for the best scholarly monograph, published in 1987. Her next book, King's Midwife, A History and Mystery of Madame de Coudray, published in 1998, received the same prize for a book published in 1998, as well as the ASEX Annabelle Jenkins Biography Prize and a Choice Outstanding Book Award. Madame de Coudray may well enjoy greater renown among French historians than she did as she traveled throughout France in the 18th century, instructing midwives at the behest of Louis XV and XVI, who feared the decline of the French population. We now know, due to Nina's painstaking and exhaustive research into thousands of documents in many archives, a great deal about Madame de Coudray's work, the challenges she faced, the network she developed, and the strategies she adopted as an unconventional professional woman without high social status. But she was also a woman who was very difficult to know, even for as an intrepid a researcher as Nina proved to be. And basic details of her life remain unknown. So Nina played in very creative ways with the genre of biography and laid bare a symbiotic relationship between subject and biography. She literally followed Madame de Coudray's path through the archives and through various cities of France to imagine how she experienced her professional life and the challenges she faced. She made the unusual decision to write a biography in the present tense. Nina inserted herself into Madame de Coudray's story to query her subject and draw plausible conclusions. There are very clear connections between this book and the book we'll be discussing today, Minerva's French Sisters, Women of Science in the Enlightenment France, published in 2021 by Yale University Press. She again faced challenges of trying to bring to light the biographies of very diffident women, largely lost to history until she revived them. But one of the things that's truly distinctive about this book is it integrates the lives and accomplishments of 6 women working in 6 different sciences and working across widely different social contexts. As today's discussion will clearly show, she again found inventive ways to play with the genre of biography, not only by speculating about their motives, as she did with the king's midwife, but also to engage with them even more directly in the letters she wrote to them in the interludes between her chapters. She thus brought these women of science to light, gave them a place in Enlightenment science, and made them directly relevant to us. Look forward to hearing from Nina about her.
My goodness, Kathleen, that is downright embarrassing.
It most certainly is not.
Thank you very much, my dear friend. And thank you to Sally and to Judith, who organized this, to Alyssa, who first alerted me to this wonderful series of presentations, and to all of you nice people who took a chunk out of your weekend on a Sunday to be here. I appreciate it so much. I see in this list a lot of my old buddies. I see a lot of folks that I know of but haven't had the pleasure to meet. And just delighted that so many of you are here. So thank you. Thank you so, so much. Let me start just by explaining my title. Voltaire, who, as you know, had Madame du Chatelet as his mistress, referred to her as Minerva. He wrote a great deal about Newton, and he said to Frederick of Prussia, "Minerva dictates and I write." In other words, even Voltaire's own work on Newton, he attributed to Madame du Chatelet. And then, of course, Madame du Chatelet herself translated Newton's Principia. It's still the only French translation that we have of that work. She was talked about pretty much from the beginning. She was known to historians, but as Voltaire's mistress. It's really only in the last 30 years or so, 35 years or so, that Madame du Chatelet has been treated as a serious scientist in her own right. So Voltaire referred to her as Minerva. 6 women I deal with are much less known, and that is why I call them Minerva's French sisters. Now, other people, contemporaries of my 6 women, referred to them as Minerva as well. So it was this notion of the Roman goddess of wisdom was attached to female scientists, not only Madame du Chatelet, but I was really playing on the idea that these were her contemporaries, her female contemporaries, much less known than she, in that sense, a part of this sisterhood. Okay, so I guess the best thing for me to do would be, Kathleen has already referred to the structure of the book, and so I'll talk a little bit about that. First, let me just tell you very briefly about who these 6 women are. And I'll start also by saying that during the course of my research, and this book took me nearly 20 years, I despaired ever being finished. My reason for doing a group biography was that I didn't think I would find enough on any one of these women to write an entire book on them. But in the course of my work, I found out quite a bit more than I had expected to. So it became very unwieldy. And some of you will be familiar with this, I'm sure, where if you work on something long enough, you start finding something in the literature, an article or whatever, that seems like it's just going to be so germane. And you look at it and you realize you took notes on it 10 years earlier. That was my situation. I was working on it for so long that I was sort of circling, looping back. So let me just tell you a little bit about these women. I encountered many others, glimpses of many others. I chose these 6 because I was able to sort of flesh them out. I was able to find considerable detail about the texture of their lives, not just their work, but their days. And that was very important to me. Stephen Shapin has written a book called Never Pure: Historical Studies of Science as if it was produced by people with bodies situated in time, space, culture, and society. So I trained by Keith Baker, of course, I am a historian of ideas, but I also need desperately in all of my work to situate these ideas, not just in the people who had them, but where did these people live? What were their daily lives like? So that was a very firm criterion for me when I chose my 6. These were women whose lives I was able to really get some kind of a handle on. As I say, I encountered lots of others. I was so eager to learn more about many of these others, and it turned out that not enough evidence remained, or at least not that I was able. Okay, so I start off the book by calling these women firsts, and they were indeed firsts in several respects. So Mademoiselle Ferrand, Elizabeth Ferrand, was the first woman to really push Newton on the continent. Pushing Newton on the continent, even for a man, was a difficult thing to do in the 1730s. Everybody was a Cartesian. In the Academy of Sciences, it was not okay to really support Newtonianism. She was among quite a very small group of people who were pushing for Newton to be recognized as having tremendous importance. And she was certainly the first woman to do it, a good decade before Madame de Chatelet got started. Then there's an astronomer, Nicole Reine Lepout, who was the first woman to ever be admitted to a scientific academy in France. It was not the Academy of Sciences. That did not happen until the 1970s. But it was the Académie de Béziers, south of France, where she had done a lot of astronomical work. Jeanne Barre, who was a field naturalist, was the first woman to sail around the world. Mademoiselle Madeleine Françoise Basseporte was the first woman to become the dessinatrice du roi at the Jardin des Plantes. No woman had ever had that job. She was the king's official botanical illustrator. She was a botanist as well, but she was this was a royal appointment, and she held on to it for nearly 50 years, tenaciously. Marie Marguerite Pierron, the anatomist, was first woman to create anatomical models of her own invention, a formula that was mostly wax, but had in it all sorts of resins and feathers and things, which made it indestructible. It neither melted nor broke. Franklin's good friend, Sir John Pringle, said, "All that is missing is stench." That's how realistic these anatomical models were. She was able to teach all year round, whereas in Paris, actual dissections were not permitted for half the year because they would rot too quickly in the warmer weather. She was also the first woman to ever give sex education classes. She did, the Diderot's daughter, among others. And finally, Geneviève d'Arconville was first woman to suspect a good 100 years before Pasteur that what caused putrefaction, what caused rotting, was something in the air. So those are my five ladies in brief, and this is the sense in which I call them firsts. They were trailblazers. There were no role models for them. They became role models. And so now let me just tell you very quickly, and then I want to turn it over to questions, a little something about each of them. So Mademoiselle Elizabeth Ferrand was a mathematician. She was a mathematician of enough renown that the Bernoulli brothers, when they traveled in France, went to visit her, not once but twice. Clairaut, the great sort of prodigy mathematician, French mathematician, was in her circle. Gabriel Kramer, not to be confused with the publisher, Gabriel Kramer was a Genevan mathematician who just worshipped her. All of her mathematical papers are lost. But we know from what we can learn in the writings of contemporaries that she was a stellar mathematician. She was also the muse and the co-author, basically, of Condillac's Traité des Sensations, the great work in epistemology, what we would call, I guess, cognitive psychology today. And he writes a 15-page homage to her at the beginning of the work. She also wanted to be known, she was an invalid and she was a recluse. So putting her story together was quite a challenge. But in the end, as she was dying, she commissioned Quentin de la Tour to do this magnificent pastel of her. It's on the cover of my book. See this? It's actually sort of a cropped version of it. But it shows Elizabeth Ferrand in front of a gigantic tome, and the name of the pastel is actually Mademoiselle Ferrand, méditant sur Newton, which is unnecessary because the gigantic poem in the back says de Newton in gigantic. This is how she wanted to be remembered. It's quite astonishing. Madame Lepout was an astronomer. Her astronomical papers were lost. The things that allowed her to get admitted to the Académie de Béziers were lost. They had to do with the transits of Venus, 1761 and 1769. We do not have those papers. So, as with so many of these stories, I had to really work with what contemporaries said about it, what male contemporaries said about it. Her major claim to fame was that she did the calculation that allowed for the accurate prediction of the return of Halley's comet, a proof of Newton's law of gravitation. Of course, it was Clairaut who stood up at the Académie des Sciences and made the announcement that in the sky on a certain day, plus or minus 3 weeks, this comet would appear. If it weren't for the astronomer Lalande, we really wouldn't know Madame Lepout's story. Jeanne Barre disguised herself as a man to become the valet of the naturalist Commerson on Bougainville's round-the-world voyage. She and Commerson had a relationship, had a legitimate child who died. They were not just lovers, but they were collaborators. She was a very humble extraction. She was domestic that he had hired basically to take care of his son. His wife died. And then she became a real scientific partner of his. And it was inconceivable to either of them that he go on this voyage without her. So she became his valet. She was not Jeanne Barre anymore. She was Jean Barre. She couldn't hide the fact that she was beardless and had a high voice. So she told everyone she was a eunuch. But she was on this voyage, and it was quite remarkable. And she helped him to gather all sorts of exotic flora from all of the times that this voyage actually landed somewhere. A tremendous amount of time at sea, frustration, both of them. And then the couple was left off by Bougainville once she was unmasked, which happened on Tahiti. Bougainville was in a very embarrassing position of having a female on his royal expedition, which was of course not allowed. So he left them both on Mauritius. And that was a different part of the story. Mademoiselle Basporte, Jardin des Plantes, was a portraitist. She secured this job, which was an extraordinary thing because the Jardin des Plantes was a male enclave where some of the great names of the day gave public lectures. And she became tremendously important to both Buffon and also to Bernard de Jussieu. We think of Jussieu as a kind of hideous building and a metro stop, but Jussieu was part of a dynasty of very important botanists. And he was a great protector of Mademoiselle Basporte, whose botanical illustrations he felt were completely indispensable to his science. Mademoiselle Basporte's partner in life was my next person, Marie-Marguerite Biéron, an anatomist. And as I mentioned before, she created these wax models. She established a museum in her home on Rue de l'Estrapade, which was a must-see. It was written up in all the guidebooks. She would teach big groups. She would teach individuals. She would teach women for their marriage, what to expect sexually. She taught d'Alembert, she taught Diderot, and they all said they learned more from her, a few lessons than they did from the Faculté de Médecine. Of course, the Faculté de Médecine was very unhappy to hear. Geneviève d'Arconville was a grande dame. She was an aristocrat. She was the daughter of a tax farmer. She married a man still wealthier at age 14. She provided him with an heir and a spare and still a third son while she was still a teenager, and then figured that she should be left alone to do her science, which she did. So that's just in brief the story of these remarkable women and science that they did. Madame d'Arconville, the last one I mentioned, had a very fully equipped laboratory, not only in her estates, which were in Crône, but in her Paris residence, which is now the Fondation de la Chasse. beautiful, beautiful hotel in the Marais, right across from the Archives, where many of us have done our work. That was her Paris house. And she had her lab there where she studied putrefying organic substances. So every one of them is a character, right down the line. Mademoiselle Ferrand harbored for 3 years the pretender to the British throne, Charles Edward Stuart, known more familiarly as Bonnie Prince Charlie. He lived in her house. Nobody knew where he was. Madame Lepout decided that she would cope with being married. 3 of the women were not married. Passeporte and Biéron chose each other as life partners, and Mademoiselle Ferrand had a female partner as well. Madame Lepout figured that she could stay alive as a scientist by having her astronomer colleague, Lalande, come into the house with her. So that was a very chaste, apparently, ménage à trois, but there he was. And it kept her from being entirely stifled by a husband who did not appreciate her and who she managed to decenter. Jean Barre, I've already told you, literally became a man in order to do what she wanted to do. Mademoiselle Passeporte got this job, which was just unprecedented for a woman, and then held on to it for 5 decades. Very proudly, toward the end of her life, not only signing her botanical illustrations, but putting her age. And she was in her 79th year, in her 80th year. She put her age right next to it. That's not something commonly done. She did it. Marie-Marguerite Biéron traveled to England twice with her exhibit. She went to consult with very important British scientists. Men went around to meet other scientists. Women did not do this. She did, with her models with her. All kinds of stories about how they almost got lost at sea, how she almost got lost at sea, but this was something she was determined to do. And Madame d'Arconville wrote many, many books. She wrote scientific translations. She wrote her famous essay on putrefaction, always anonymously. That was how she dealt being a married woman and a woman of very, very high status. She wrote all kinds of things, but she always hid behind this veil of anonymity. Okay, I think I'll stop there. Kathleen mentioned that I write letters to these women. I do indeed do that. There's an interlude between each chapter and next, where I ask the women questions that I was unable to answer in my research and that I think the reader would want to know as well. They do not answer me. I'm not that far gone. But it was very important for me to gather together the things that I thought that I was just itching to know more about and to pose these questions in this manner. I also thought that these women should be brought up to date. I thought there were things they had the right to know. So, for example, with the astronomer, I think she was pretty unsung in her day. I mean, she did get admitted to an academy, but she got eclipsed really by these more aggressive men, the Academy of Sciences. But I think she should know there's a lunar crater named for her, and an asteroid named for her, and a street in Paris now named for her, right near the Très Grande Bibliothèque, the Trop Grande Bibliothèque. Yeah. Okay, so I'll stop there.
So first of all, I encourage you to put questions to the chat. Nina's given us a taste of science. She's given us brief taste of their eccentric challenges, and she's really only given us brief taste of some of the most engaging elements of, as I told her, for all of these women, she has done such an incredible job of placing them in actual context that you can go her trip to Paris, where they live, where they work. If you've spent time, you'll have a real immediate of the life experience. But overall, it seems to me there are 3 areas that seem particularly interesting to me. And one is, and for me, they would focus on science, gender, and Also, the particular character of the find so intriguing. Start with science. I'm truly impressed at the way that Nina can say to readers what's happening, how it relates to developments in the science, make them clear to non-specialist science. I wonder if she could say something beyond the accomplishment of these women, whether they change our understanding of science and enlightenment, and whether the women themselves responded to science and the enlightenment differently than their patriarchy.
Okay, well, the women, of course, were completely excluded from all of the big scientific ventures of the day. So they could not be in the Académie des Sciences. They could not be editors of scientific periodicals. They could not be acknowledged as contributors to the Encyclopédie, although more and more is coming to light now about female contributors to the Encyclopédie whose articles were anonymous. And I can't argue that any of my women contributed because I don't honestly know. But so the first thing, in answer to your question, Kathleen, is that they were officially excluded from all of these, the Observatoire, the Faculté de Médecine, and yet they were very, very much on the periphery of these institutions because of their circle of acquaintances. There were many men who assisted them. It's the thing one expects, I suppose, with female scientists is that they are assisting men. This was flipped. The men assisted them. They, of course, had to ask for this assistance, but these were men of tremendous distinction, and they helped to get them started, and then they really did proceed as soloists. So there are just so many women in the history of science who were, well, Lavoisier's wife. I would have loved to put Lavoisier's wife in my book, but it's impossible to extract or to disentangle what she did and what he did. She was intimately involved in science, but that was too much of a package deal there. So my women are navigating scientific terrain from the outside, but getting help from the inside, and then going about their own business. Sometimes acknowledged, sometimes not acknowledged. So, for example, the anatomist, Mademoiselle Elizabeth, who had, as I say, this museum of her own, it attracted a tremendous amount of attention. It attracted gigantic crowds. She did her dissections in the courtyard of her building. Thanks to Google Earth, we can now look down at that courtyard. It now has a bunch of garbage cans in it and some trees, but at the time it was just her space. Madame de Genlis, it was her délice, and that she called it her boudoir. But anyway, that's where she did her anatomical research. But she also presented, thanks to a surgeon named Morin. I don't know how many of you are familiar with his name. But he was a big cheese. He was very thrilled by what she had accomplished. And unlike many others who were rivals or who were jealous or who were trying to undermine women making such attempts, he was a huge supporter of hers. He was also, incidentally, a supporter of Madame Boudret, midwife. But anyway, he arranged to have her present 3 times, not once, not twice, but 3 times. Once in 1759, once in 1770, and once again in 1771 at the Académie des Sciences, to show her models, to demonstrate what it was she was able to do in her teaching. And so we have this funny, I think all of these women, I refer in my introduction to Michel de Certeau. Some of you are certainly familiar with his work on everyday life, where he talks about the ways in which you can find play in the machine. The strategies are laid out by those in power, but you can figure out ways to sort of navigate within and make a place and a space for yourself. that's how I would really describe what these women did. They didn't want to rock the boat. They didn't want to be shut down. They figured out how to deal with the male enclaves of science in extremely creative ways, very innovative ways, very unprecedented ways, so that they could be left alone to do their thing.
I think one thing that speaks to that inverted relationship that you just supplied is the very first page of the book, that supporting characters are all men, as opposed to having characters or women, which would ordinarily be the companionate science relationship just mentioned that Robert. We have a couple of questions in the chat. One from Lepout, who'd like to know something about difficulties of your courses and how you had to work around the fact that, or as many cases, you had to about rather than writing. Maybe you speak more generally about the difficulties faced uncovering. I know this is much of the story of 20 work.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you, Alyssa, for the lovely question. I did not plant you, but I love that question. Yeah, so here's the thing. I did indeed at the beginning of the book put several pages of names, and I called these individuals actors in a supporting role, because I so much wanted this to be the women's stories. And yet I was very, very dependent on what their male contemporaries said about them, because so much about their own work, so much of their own work was not preserved by the custodians of culture, the curators and the archivists who decided that these things were insignificant. So people on the list of actors in a supporting role, I mention them only in the context that I need them for my story. In other words, Diderot is there, and Rousseau is there, and Franklin is there, and Bougainville is there, and Turgot is there, and I could just go on and on. D'Alembert is there. But the ways in which they are important to my story, that is how they are listed. I don't say Franklin, great statesman. I say Franklin, supporter of Pierron and Basco. Okay, so that people can, because there are a lot of names in this book. But I very much wanted this to be the story of the women. So I desperately needed what others said about them, but I also paid a lot of attention to their deeds. Deeds don't lie. These women made choices. They did certain things. They were determined to do certain things. They were, all 6 of them, examples of very creative aging. We're in a period where life expectancy is maybe 40 best. Okay, it's a skewed number because it involves a lot of infant mortality. I'm uncomfortable with some of these numbers, but these women lived in their 60s, 70s, 80s. The science kept them going. They didn't do this for a year or two as dilettantes. They did this with tremendous perseverance. I think it was Elaine Tyler May who said, you can't just stick with the conventional story and add women and stir. You have to really bring the margins into the center. And that was what I tried to do. So in answer to the question of how I managed to piece all of this together, I did very much rely on correspondence by the men with whom these women were involved. And then I scrounged around for every possible thing I could find by the women themselves. So for example, even though Mademoiselle Ferrand's mathematical work is gone, correspondence with the Genevan mathematician Gabriel Kramer turned up in the archives of Geneva. And I have a letter, it's actually illustrations in my book, where she's talking to him all about Hooke and Newton and machinations at the Academy of Sciences. She had her finger on the pulse of the science of today. And I don't want to bore you, but I could go into that kind of little bits and snatches, little tidbits of things I was able to find for each of these women, supplemented, of course, by the correspondence and the manuscripts of the men with whom they were involved. The one stellar thing that we have are the vélins, the illustrations on vellum that Mademoiselle Elizabeth produced for the Jardin des Plantes. That is a collection called the Vélins du Roi. She contributed 300 some odd botanical illustrations to it. All of her predecessors were male. And so of course, their illustrations are there as well. But there's a huge chunk of illustrations by her, which I spent a tremendous amount of time on. I had to get umpteen permissions to even see these things. I had to sit there with two people watching me, white gloves on. But that was a case where there were tangible remains of her that I could work with. But Mademoiselle Biéron's anatomical models, for example, have not been preserved, even though there are at the École de Médecine all kinds of models in, actual body parts in formaldehyde, but also wax models done after her. But she was the pioneer of this particular kind of pedagogy. So I'll just end I'm answering it to great length, I'm sorry, but I just want to finish by saying what these women chose to do was the most important thing for me. Their actions, the choices they made, their determination to do science, and that we can track. We know how many years Biéron had her museum. We know how many years Ferrand had her Salon of mathematicians around her. We know Madame Lepout didn't just predict the calculation for Halley's Comet, but made eclipse maps. Those we have. So I made it my business. Oh, and d'Arconville, who was a very prolific writer, always, as I say, published anonymously. So in her case, that was a tricky one because I had a lot of what she wrote herself, but I didn't have contemporaries talking about her because they were sworn to secrecy. She was publishing anonymously. They couldn't blow her cover. So, but she wrote also 12 volumes of manuscript memoirs. She dictated them in her old age. And that's the kind of thing, of course, that make all of us salivate. And you have to begin to get into the whole issue of somebody's own self-presentation and how that's not necessarily the most objective thing in the world. But boy, that was a goldmine.
One of the things, that I kept having to say to myself, but she persisted because all of your women confront specific obstacles. And one of the things that you greatly admire about them, make absolutely clear, how much all of them are driven to know. And that you suggest even that science is alive, and that makes their intellectual engagement may well have. It may also have been the fact that many of them didn't marry, didn't have children, like the likelihood of greater longevity in the century. So they made personal as well allow them pursue science. So, you make clear their desire to know. I wonder whether they also share, or you see them as sharing, the Condorcet's passion for the public, or what do they see their scientific adding? Is it simply the pursuit of knowledge, or do most of them have much broader?
Okay, so in the case of d'Arconville, who's very explicit about this, it is for the benefit of humankind. She says that in her scientific translations, her own treatise, absolutely. These are not women who are seeking any kind of personal glory. They're pretty sure they're not going to get it. D'Arconville is very explicit about how you really gain nothing if you identify yourself as a scientific woman. You just get mocked. And if your ideas are good, they get usurped anyway from you and claimed by some man. So why? She's perfectly happy to remain anonymous. And so that's a wonderful question, because yes, indeed, they are propelled, they are inner driven, they are determined to know and learn. Biéron is not just somebody who makes wax models to show to the public. She's constantly doing dissections. She's fascinated by the human body. She wants desperately to really understand. And by the way, the cadavers she gets, of course, are, not generally fresh. Let's just put it that way. So she's seen internal organs of all kinds of, in all kinds of states of decrepitude. And she has to do a tremendous amount of work to create organs that are healthy and well. And so their perseverance and their determination and their passion for what they're doing is shared by all of them. But so is this idea that they are educators, they are teachers, they're telling people things that they think are worthwhile. And with Ferrand, I can't say much about her mathematical papers except how much she was admired by really great mathematicians. But when she started working with Condillac on his Traité des Sensations, she knew that he was going to publish this book, and she thought it was hugely important to have. Basically, what they were trying to do was quite Newtonian. They were trying to figure out one sort of single law of human cognition. They came up with sensations. We learn everything from our sensations. They outlocked Locke, okay? Because Locke still has the reflection of the mind and other things going on in there, whereas they were real sensationalists. But every one of them, Madame Lepout, with her astronomical work, she actually thought this was, she then became the editor of certain almanacs, which told people how to study the night sky, how to learn these astronomical phenomena for themselves. Every one of them really was determined to, and Mademoiselle Elizabeth at the Jardin des Plantes, she was a real networker. She was determined to not just do her botanical work, but also she helped, this is curious, there was a very famous chemical lecturer at the Jardin des Plantes, Rouelle, who taught Diderot and taught, in fact, Madame d'Arconville. And it was actually Mademoiselle Elizabeth who got him the money to become the chemist that he was, because of her sort of understanding of the sociability of scientific questions.
There are a couple of questions in the chat that both relate to legacies. All of your last asked about whether these mentor other women of science, legacy of science, and persuaded that these are women of science. Wonder how they trailblazers, other women of, if there are not other women of science immediately following. They're the first, they're not only the first these accomplishments, but in a way the last. I wonder if you assess their legacy.
Okay. So this is very often the case with people who kind of have to claw their way up to the top. They don't look charitably down the ladder and hoist others up with them. It's not just true in science, but in general. So in the case of Basport, she had many disciples, but they weren't really scientific. She taught the art of flower painting to a lot of women so that they would have an economic livelihood. That's different. That really, of all six, is the only one who I can say during her lifetime had people who she mentored, and it wasn't really in her capacity as a scientist. So I'm not so much claiming that these are trailblazers, but I believe that I think that examples of this kind are absolutely necessary given the paucity of women in the STEM fields today. I think that the stories of women who do important science whenever and wherever they do it are very inspiring examples for young girls today to get into the field and young women to stay in the field, because that's one of the huge problems. We have people sort of peeling off as you go up to the higher echelons of science today. You may have a whole lot of people majoring in science, but as they go through the rigors of graduate school and then trying to get tenure and somehow raise a family as well, they fall by the wayside. So I think that, I was pleased enough to be able to present these women as examples, even though they are 250 years ago, even though they are not American. I like to think that English-speaking readers would find in their perseverance a real inspiration. But it's absolutely true that they did not start schools, that they did not. One of the reasons that I write these letters and introduce them to each other is because they didn't know each other, except for the two who were actually a couple. And they should have known each other, because men had all kinds of ways of all kinds of brotherhoods, which could make them feel that they were part of some really sort of historical venture, some kind of progressive venture. Women had nothing of the. So I think Dina's question is a very valid one, but I also think that we need to look back and see examples of people who were really who navigated a very unfriendly terrain, who overcame all sorts of obstacles and really did prevail. And I'm sorry, but Nuala's question, I think I went to Dina's first. What was Nuala's question?
You answered it. Her question was about their legacies by mentoring their young.
Yeah, it was it was hard enough for them. And Kathleen, you mentioned earlier, 3 of them were married.
Right.
That was very, marriage in 18th France for a woman was the pits. Widowhood was a whole lot better. But marriage was just completely confining, really impossible. And motherhood, God. So, these women managed that in just extraordinarily creative ways. Lepout, who was childless, as I say, brought her astronomer colleague, Jerome Lalande, into her home. Her husband was the royal clockmaker, or one of many royal clockmakers. And so he, Lalande encouraged the husband to make astronomical clocks, for example, so that he kind of fit in with that couple and was able to create a space. I think his presence created space for her to keep her science alive. And Jeanne Barre actually married, but long after her science was done, around 40. And Geneviève d'Arconville, who, as I say, married at 14, produced 3 sons for her husband. And then basically, he was quite passive after that. He basically allowed her to do what she did. But I think one reason she published anonymously was because she didn't just write on science. She wrote on l'amitié, on les passions. She wrote on marriage. What she wrote on marriage could make your blood run cold. She hated marriage. But here she was, married, and not just that, but a person, a well-known person, higher echelon society. So her anonymity was a very important weapon for her. But none of them created a legacy that we can immediately track. Okay, in the early 19th century, we don't have people saying, "I was inspired by so and so." I can't make that.
Leanna has a different sort of question that might make us think a little bit differently about legacy, trailblazing, like that. She says these women are compared to successful science men of life, but how do they stand in relation to the famous male surely exist outside of them? In other words, how unusual are they in science politics of the time? Just a gender issue.
Well, the male unknowns, I wouldn't know. I'm trying to think.
Well, I mean, it might bear thinking about these women were really accomplished and there surely have to have been a lot of male scientists, not as perhaps legitimately.
Well, right, or who were deliberately obscured by their more famous. Yes, so this is of course an issue, and those men should be resurrected by somebody who's interested in doing that. And sure, there were surely many of them. It doesn't have to be my thing. I mean, from early on, I was attracted to the Enlightenment and the French Revolution as far back as I can, high school basically, and I loved all this, reason and tolerance and progress and then liberté, égalité, fraternité. But early on, the fraternité thing really bothered me. I wanted to know where were the girls. And so, I'm not the kinds of things that Liana is mentioning, that she's absolutely correct, that there are plenty of people who have been brought out of the shadows, men who could have been brought out of the shadows, who probably should be brought out of the shadows. And who knows, they may even have done many things of great importance, though they are unsung. It just was not my mission.
So, Tip would congratulate you on the book, but he also is hoping that Yale is doing a good job of pushing your book to them. Are they by any chance?
I think all of us have the experience with academic presses of having a lot thrown back on us. Even Kathleen, your brave, wonderful hijacking history from Oxford, you know, that is such a big book, such an important book. And I like to think they're doing more than they are, in fact, doing for you in terms of making it known. So I mean, Yale was a wonderful press to work with. I can get that on tape. I'm happy to say it, the get-go. I had wonderful experiences with my other books with the University of California, with the editor Sheila Levine, who fortunately passed away, and the whole list at California is quite transformed now. But Yale was wonderful. However, basically what we authors need to do is write blogs and things like that make our work known. I'm not great on social media. I do not have a presence there, but I have buddies who wrote about the book when it first came out, which I appreciate and thank them for. But in fact, these presses don't have really the wherewithal to make things as known as they ought to be.
You know, the issue of the connections, and looking for last question. But one of the things that your book does is, in essence, especially in the letter, press young science, whose 18th century sources of it. But I wonder if you could say a few more words about, for people who haven't read the book, one of the major innovations in geography is your practice of letter writing. And I wonder if you could just speak for a few about all of the things those letters allowed you to do that you could not do. I think they're really engaging and they really connect with it. And they do a lot of work in the structure.
Well, thank you for that. I have a feeling there may be readers who, you know, don't get them, don't appreciate them. But I think that there were indeed things that frustrated me tremendously that I was unable to really make much progress with. I went down a bunch of rabbit holes, and I wanted to make that clear in the letters. I wanted to have people understand that however carefully you do your research, there's always material that you don't, that you're not lucky enough to happen upon, or that simply does not exist any longer. And so you can't fabricate answers to questions. You can be very, very frank about having those questions. And that was important for me to make clear. I think that biography is, of course, a patriarchal genre, the whole sort of womb to tomb, cradle to grave, everything making perfect sense, some omniscient voice narrating the entire thing. That's just out. I mean, not to say that there aren't some wonderful biographies written along those lines and that kind of format, but I think making the teller part of the tale, and I'm certainly not the only one to have done this kind of thing. Robert Rosenstone has done it. Clifford Geertz has not. I mean, you know, this is not a feminist thing necessarily, but I think that when we become very engaged with our subject, it's okay to acknowledge that and why the particular subject became meaningful to us. And in the chapters are sort of the canonical scholarly chapters that one would expect. I don't think that's the place for the teller of the tale to come forth. But I felt a tremendous need to ask these kinds of questions, and I came up with this idea of these interludes, just to sort of satisfy my feeling that readers also would have these kinds of questions. And as you said, Kathleen, to make these stories a little bit more relevant to the present. I mean, I end by pointing out that the Tour Eiffel has bunches of names of scientists and engineers wrapped all around the first level of, I don't know how many of you have even noticed that, but there are a bunch of names up there. Not a single one is a woman. And the Academy of Sciences in France didn't admit a woman until the very end of the day. So this is not okay. And to to just discuss these women, to discuss their courage, to discuss their stamina, to discuss how their grit. I like to think might be inspiring to some of the females going into science today, because it's still a gigantic battle.
The final question. One comes from Dina, who wonders about the women you didn't find enough about to write about, and whether that was the case because they were not attached to Yale.
Might have been. There was, and the other thing that I very much wanted to do was to present 6 different fields. I mean, a mathematician, an astronomer, and a field naturalist, a botanist of gardens, and an anatomist and a chemist. That worked for me. I didn't want a lot of duplication, but I do think, yeah, I mean, you see the occasional name of somebody, and then you do everything possible to locate that individual, situate that individual, find more about that individual, and it just becomes impossible. If I had been willing to give another 20 years to this, maybe I could have had 12 people in the book instead of 6. But I fairly early, I saw that I had stuff to work with here. These 6.
Also, a question from Nuala. Was there anything, almost a perfect point to end, is there anything from your sources that did not cause you great delight or horror, made you laugh out?
Lots. I'll leave everybody in suspense with that one. But
oh no, you can't think of something horrible, surely.
I mean, look, because I just found them so fascinating as people. I mean, in a way, the fact that Elizabeth Ferrand was harboring Prince Charlie has absolutely nothing to do with my book, and nothing to do with my story, but it shows something about her for sure, right? And her machinations, to kind of keep him safe, keep him from somehow revealing himself, because he was really not careful. And she was a Jacobite, as many French were. They were very happy to have Catholics back on the throne in England. They wanted that, right? But I mean, how he came to choose her house as his right nest, as he called it, I don't know. But it was a detail that I thought was important to kind of show what sort of very unorthodox individual she was. Let me just say one really quick thing about my previous book, and I'm putting this out there because for those of you who are looking for a topic, Madame Ducoudray had a niece. It wasn't really a niece. She adopted a woman named Madame Coutenceau and called her niece because she didn't have children of her own to pass on her intellectual legacy, her reputation. And this Madame Coutenceau became the head of the maternity hospital in Bordeaux. And all of this, of course, was during and after the revolution. And I was midwifed out at that. But I have always thought that Madame Coutenceau, of course, figures in my midwife book, but I did not want to write another book about another midwife. But her story should definitely be by somebody.
And that for viewers, Karen's wants to know if she can get signed copies of her nieces. She can work
that's
that
so
out
cute.
with you.
That's very sweet. Thank you. That's lovely.
Well, I would like to thank all of you for taking part of your Sunday afternoon with about her absolutely fabulous book. Read it, and there are hands of applause going up. Many viewers, and it's been great fun to
thank you so much.
Fabulous.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thanks to all of you,
Thanks,
really,
Judy
for taking the time.
Sally.